Hi guys, this is Curtis from Grey and Patina, and we're sitting with an amazing collector friend of mine, Josh, up here in Northern California. It's a little bit smoggy and smoky from the fires, but hopefully we'll be able to get through today and not choke on ourselves. But Josh has brought some really crazy watches, I hear, with one in particular that I've always wanted to see in person. Never had a chance, so hopefully he brought it here in the flesh.
Thanks for having me, Curtis, and definitely want to share a lot of my passion behind why I pursued some of these pieces that we're going to talk about today, and specifically this one right here that I brought. It is reference 6542, red text, the GMT that kind of started it all. But I think what kind of differentiates this from what you may see out there in the world of 6542s is that line of red text that says GMT Master. This is one of the first, if not the first, 6542. The serial number on this is 112,000, so really great story behind it. Very well-known dealer tracked this one down from the original family. And it really caught my eye when I saw it, but I think that combined with the provenance and the historical significance of this, not just this particular watch and what it means to Rolex, but what it ushered forth in terms of the GMT line and its kind of permanence in the three most iconic and well-known Rolex sport watch lines out there.
So bold statements.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, without any of that information, I mean, this watch is gorgeous. I think what most people don't realize about the 6542, you've got that bake-like bezel, right? That's one of the most fragile bezels Rolex has ever made.
Yes.
And to find one intact, I think is a rarity in itself. Not to mention the dial, the lume, and everything, and then, you know, without even touching the red text, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of explain the story of how you found this piece and what it took to get it.
Well, it took a lot. As you know, in the world of vintage Rolex, things have really escalated a lot in value. And when you combine historical significance with scarcity, it becomes kind of the magic formula. Michael Morgan is the dealer that sourced this watch. It came to my attention through his Instagram feed, and the conversation that we had around the watch is really what clinched it for me in terms of why I wanted it. The watch was found in Southern California by Michael Morgan. He sourced it from the daughter of the original owner. The gentleman that owned this watch, his name was Robert Leffingwell. And the story goes that he produced one of those claymation commercials for Rolex called The Story of Time. And it was nominated for Academy Award when he produced it. And that particular movie that was made for Rolex became an advertisement piece for the earliest Datejust watches.
Right.
And he was gifted this GMT for his relationship with Rolex, and this is the watch that eventually launched the GMT line. As you know, the Pan Am story where pilots needed that type of a watch for their travel between time zones.
So you know, reading a little bit about the profile snapshot that you sent over to me, I mean, this watch has it all. Not only is it one of the earliest, if not the earliest, appearance of a GMT, if we can use comic book terms, yeah, first appearance, right? Mm-hmm. But this is also a military watch, right? I mean, Robert served in World War II?
He served in World War II. His service predates his acquisition of the watch, but he was a military guy. He also had a very interesting relationship with Disney. He was one of the animators for the Snow White movie and then some of the Disney films of that era. And when he did the commercial slash movie for Rolex, it was during his time where he actually ran his own animation studio. So that would have been in the mid 50s around the time this watch came to be.
And that story of time that you mentioned, the one that he was nominated for, I believe, for an Oscar for,
Right.
What I read that you provided was also that he lost against his old former boss, Walt Disney.
Yeah. So when he was nominated that year for the Academy Award, he lost that category to Walt Disney. So
Not a bad person to come in second place with.
Yeah, his old boss. But that I feel that relationship to Rolex, and then also the significance of the person that owned it, and then also just the rarity of this combination of dial type within the 6542 lineup,
right.
is kind of the perfect blend of historical significance and importance, and then also the condition, as you can see, of the watch elevates it into another stratosphere.
So before we get deeper into more background on the watch, were you seeking this out? I mean, I can't imagine someone's looking like, I've always wanted to own the very first GMT.
Yeah, Robert Leffingwell's watch. Anybody have that? No, it's. I think the story became part of why my interest in it was heightened, and I think I wanted a 6542.
Right.
Definitely, that reference point in my collecting lineup was important to have. But if you hear that story and you look at the condition of the watch and the scarcity, it kind of checked all the boxes, so to speak. And then,
so, was it Michael tapping you on the shoulder? Was it floated out there in the ether?
I expressed interest to him almost in a jokingly way, because I knew it was going to be one of those tough acquisitions from a financial standpoint. But as they say, when you go after something like this, the hurt from that tends to subside after you have that acquisition in hand.
No pain, no gain.
No
right?
pain, no gain. Exactly. So it was a lot. At the time I acquired this, the Newman had just hit that record. It seemed like Daytonas were all the rage. It was that time everybody was after a Daytona, and I actually gave up a Paul Newman Daytona as part of the negotiation to acquire this watch. So that was just part of
Sure.
the deal that was negotiated. So a Newman and various other pieces. I think a Submariner, radial dial 1675, and some other things were acquired in the mix in his direction.
So I think the story to really tell is, you showed up with a bag full of cash, and before you left the watch, Michael looked at you and said, "Hey, Josh, what are you wearing on your wrist?" "Oh, it's a Paul Newman. I want it." I think that's how it went, right?
That's going to be part of it. That's going to be part of it. Yeah, I think when a lot of collectors could probably relate with me on this, is like sometimes you just have to pull out all the stops when you feel like the opportunity may not present itself again. And I never want to look back at something as like that's the one that got away.
Right.
And I think when you hear the story and when you hear the significance of not just this piece in Rolex's lineup, but the significance of what the original owner did for Rolex, the first commercial for the Datejust, which is arguably a very important watch to Rolex even today.
Sure.
There's a lot of different pieces to this conversation that add to the significance of this watch, and that's why I wasn't really looking for the fair price. It was just, what is it going to take?
Yeah, how much could you bleed before you got it?
Michael's good at that. If you've ever dealt with him, he'll get you for what
he's like 3 liters, scientifically 3 liters of blood, and the Paul Newman.
Right.
But
right.
okay, so look, I think that puts into perspective like what you're willing to sacrifice.
Yeah.
Why this watch? I mean, I understand the story, right? But how do you pick these pieces? Because you had to give up significant pieces. Paul Newman is obviously a cultural icon,
Yes.
and probably to most people that aren't into watches, more significant or more recognizable, I should say, than
Sure.
a GMT 6542.
Sure. I agree with you. The Paul Newman, even when I acquired it, was a very aspirational piece for me. And I feel the decision behind that was due to the fact that although the Newman is a rare piece, it can be acquired again. You know, it's one of those things where if you have the means, you can check that box again later.
Right.
And I think any collector that's actually tried to pursue it realizes that it's not necessarily just the rarity, but the opportunities can be there pretty readily if needed.
What you're trying to say, Josh, is that there's levels to this game.
Yeah, I think so. And you know what? I think also the significance of vintage Rolex in general, when we look at these stainless steel sport watches,
right,
and what they mean to us as utility and tool watches first and historical significance first, it's, and I've heard you use the term before, it's kind of the low-key flex,
yep,
right? It takes a level of understanding to realize and appreciate. And as you develop that education, as you kind of realize where all of the attributes that create a beautiful piece lie, it becomes even more valuable to you,
sure,
as a collector. And I think that when you look at the 6542, it is important, but when you add all these elements, it elevates it even more, this one in particular. And that's why I love vintage Rolex, and you can look at all these different details that make up the piece, but what is ultimately, I feel, the most important is the story behind the watch. And I love holding something that's 30, 40, 50, 60 years old and realizing that it had a life before you and it's going to have a life after you. And I think that is really what's cool about these pieces, is they last. They're very timeless. And even though the design elements change on a very subtle way over time, it adds to that story.
You and I have had this conversation for quite some time, and it's an evolving conversation, because I think, the nature and state of vintage Rolex and the prices that it has reached is something still new to us, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about these as tool watches, and maybe that's the reason why we love them, right?
Yeah,
for the purpose that they were created in. But I think for most people, especially the barrier to entry to some of these more grail pieces, they're definitely a collector watch now.
Sure.
At what point, are we at that point where these watches are now considered art? Because if you look at some of the watches that are trading at and the auction prices, I mean, they're going for easy 7 figures.
Yeah. You definitely have to use that perspective sometimes, and I definitely feel that although there are those grail pieces like this one that might have reached those types of stratospheres in pricing, there are still those very achievable price points where somebody can own something very attractive and still historically significant without breaking the bank. And I think that that's very important to carry any type of not just community, but to sustain the interest in something like this.
There has to be still a door open, I feel like, for that future collector.
Yes. And I think, Grey and Patina, definitely, you offer that wide range. You've got those really, I would say, aspirational pieces, but also those pieces that are kind of, the term is neo-vintage now, right?
Yeah.
So
thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, the plug, right?
Yeah. I think that is a key thing about even owning a grail piece like this, right? Where I feel like you're still excited about finding that 5513 that's maybe unpolished. That still gets you.
Absolutely. You'll see that it runs. It runs the gamut, like I'm not only interested in the pieces that are super rare and outside the realm of attainability.
Right.
It's the story that drove it first, but naturally with scarcity comes the tag that's associated with it. But at the same time, I feel that there's really beautiful pieces that will have that potential, especially the ones that are throughout the late 80s and early 90s that are starting to hit stride. They are, I think, in the next 15 to 20 years, going to be the ones that are going to be super difficult to find as complete sets, super difficult to find in mint untouched condition. They still exist in drawers today, and I think that the evolution is going to is going to elevate all the rest of the pieces. Exactly.
And so it's one of those things that you're seeing in the classic car world, right? And I say classic, even though I'm talking about cars from the 80s, like
the 50K Honda Civic.
Yes, Pontiac Firebirds, like just really cars that were obtainable, but maybe not so when we were growing up, right? And those became, you see that in the early Porsches, and I could see that easily happening if it's obvious it's already happening in the 80s and 90s Rolex vintage watches that are still in that tritium range. And
absolutely. And they're also aging very well too, because now you're seeing some of those pieces with like the cream to yellow looms, and you're also even the more recent Daytona, the Pana dial, the cream dial. Those are very interesting under the conditions. The way they age and the story behind that is always something that is desirable to the collector that is looking for that like just so element of differentiation.
Because we talked about like this is the first, known GMT, but we're also talking about on the opposite end of the spectrum, those are the last known tritium or watches that really have character and variables, right?
Correct.
That late 90s watch, after that whole Six Sigma manufacturing process and Rolex really tightening and pulling in all those manufacturing pieces in-house.
Yeah.
It's really hard to make a point that, hey, these Batmans are really going to be very different. Mark III Batman, Mark IV Batman. They won't exist.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about like the formula, right? And you used the word alchemy, and I think that it's a great word to use because you can't perfect the recipe for scarcity. You can't. The second you go out there and you start to call things limited edition,
Panerai.
Exactly. I mean, that comes to mind.
Yes.
When you try to assign it artificial scarcity, it always backfires. It becomes something that isn't really, it isn't naturally occurring, right? And the tropical dials, they're defects, but they became desirable because the way to get there had to be through utility.
Yes.
Right? Like the tropical dial dive watches were in the sun, the guy that was, spear fishing or whatever in the tropics and wearing that watch, it took on that patina because it was a product of its environment over decades.
And also, you had to avoid a Rolex service center for 60 years.
Correct.
Or just your tool became too invaluable to leave at a service center.
Correct.
And so I think all those things that you can refer to really build on that character and build off that story. A watch can be beautiful, I feel like, at first glance, right? But the more you know about it, some watches tend to become less appealing, and others definitely deepen the depth of appreciation.
Correct. And that elevation based on understanding is really what I love about it. And, me as a collector, I started my journey in the modern pieces. I liked the things that were kind of like perfect in production, or as we put it, more limited because of the barrier to entry.
Sure.
Right. So the Audemars Royal Oak offshores were hot at that time. I did have a Rolex. My first one was a two-tone Daytona, but these were not pieces that I sought out for character or for provenance. They were pieces that I felt that, hey, these mark certain levels of watch collecting on a broad scale. And going into vintage, it was a much different learning curve and education process, and I've met some really great guys along the way that kind of give me that information and have guided me through that process. And
I think that's the key thing that most people forget. I think unless you're like an Eric Wynn or an Eric Koo, I guess the Erics have like an air of knowledge, right? Because for most collectors, dealers, and you rely on that community. You cannot do this without that community of references and knowledge and be able to look and see, like, have you seen this pop up in this zero range?
You're going to make some mistakes along the way. And, I think now that because there's that plethora of not just online education, but Instagram and the accessibility of everything,
Right.
It makes it easier for somebody to kind of navigate if this is what they want to participate with.
Simple question. When do you wear this? What's the occasion?
Rarely ever. I will take it, out to, just like a special, event that I want to be kind of commemorating, but it's not very frequent at all. And it's because this is also very high radiation. If you put a Geiger to this, I have
Do you
one.
have a
I
we'll
do.
have to
I
Geiger
do.
later.
We'll definitely put it on there,
Let
and
me
it'll
aim that towards you for a time being.
But it's definitely something that you want to kind of maintain in its condition, because so many elements here are very fragile. So I'm not gonna go play racquetball with this or shoot hoops. It's gonna be something that just kind of is in a casual environment and usually around others that would appreciate what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that I feel would go by unnoticed to the common, observer.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you so much for bringing this out, because this is a real treat to see this in the flesh. But this is not the only watch, not the only fire you brought for us today, right?
No, I have some other things that I think would be interesting to discuss. Yeah.